Okay, everybody, I guess we'll go ahead and get started here. Once again, welcome. My name's Andy Dolph. I'm an agronomist. I work for Redox Bionutrients up in the Pacific Northwest, and we're just on the verge of another growing season here. Still a little bit of snow on the ground in my neighborhood, but the sun is out. Things are starting to move, so people are beginning to get busy. But as always, we're thinking about plant nutrition this time of year. For those of you that are new to Redox, you haven't heard about Redox before. Redox is a bionutrient company. We're very much focused on plant available nutrition, and every product that Redox offers is carbon based. So we are very keen about providing efficient plant nutrition in a carbon-based format. So very much in the sustainable realm and the highly efficient realm. So that's kind of the basis from where we're coming from. And today's conversation is going to be about calcium. Calcium is one of my favorite topics personally. There are several high points we're going to cover today, some of the challenges and opportunities for improving calcium nutrition. So I've been working in the tree fruit industry here in Washington State for the last 30 years. We have some acute challenges with calcium related disorders and an ongoing need for calcium content to preserve the marketable yield of the crops that we grow here. And a lot of the things that we deal with can be compared to or applied to other cropping systems. And so let's dive into this. I'm going to try to keep our presentation here today to around 20 to 25 minutes. So I'm going to move through this fairly quickly. Calcium functions in the plant. Calcium is an essential plant nutrient. This is probably a review for most of you. It performs a very broad range of functions in all plants, including what is listed here. So a critical structural component, and really I think that's what most people think about when they think about calcium nutrition. So a component of the cell wall and the cell membrane. It's the glue that helps stick cells together, which is an incredibly important part of plant structure. Calcium plays a structural and regulatory role in the growth of plant roots. And in pollen tubes, both are absolutely essential to outcomes in many of the cropping systems that we deal with. Calcium is also a critical part of a plant's ability to perceive and to respond to both abiotic and biotic stress. In terms of calcium benefits, and I'm being selfish here, I think a lot about my situation in tree fruit, but again, these principles apply to many crops. So the ions accumulating in the cell wall and middle lamella provide the structural strength that we need. And what this translates into for us is, for example, the perception of dessert quality, crunchy apples, firm blueberries, crisp lettuce. And of course, we also get the benefit of the crop's ability to endure the type of handling that we subject it to. So during the harvest process, post-harvest handling, packaging, placing produce on supermarket displays, etc., calcium is really critical to the success of that whole production system. We also see an increased temperature tolerance within plants. So with respect to the plant's ability to deal with heat stress in the field, just simply the high daytime temperatures, calcium is involved in that. Where the cash crop is directly exposed to the sun, like in apples, for example, we see a benefit in a resistance to the development of sunburn. And so the cell membrane fluidity is directly related to the amount of calcium that's there. When calcium nutrition is good, we see benefits in storability and shelf life of crops. This is the result of reduced ethylene production and respiration rates. Uh, these both result in a delay in the senescence of the fruit. Calcium inactivates enzyme activity that breaks down cell walls, which delays the softening process. Calcium is also strongly tied to the reduction or absence of storage disorders, so it really plays a key role in so many cropping systems. So shifting gears here a little bit, how do plants actually get calcium naturally? And the expectation, of course, is that plants will retrieve mineral nutrition from the soil. Calcium's included in that. What we know is that plants take up calcium from the soil by exuding organic acids. And you can see that here in this picture on the right-hand side. With the hydrogen ions here being exchanged for calcium ions. So you're dislodging the calcium from this clay organic matter complex, and then it gets translocated or transferred into the root. Once we dislodge the calcium ion from the soil colloid using this organic acid ion exchange, the free calcium is in the soil solution and it's drawn into the plant via mass flow, which is driven by transpiration. And this process is limited to this rapid entry zone here on the other side, immediately behind the root cap, where these microscopic root hairs are shown. And active root growth in this zone being active is really a function of active root growth. So a couple of points here. The calcium content of most soils is sufficient to support plant growth in general. And while this is true, and this is something that comes up quite often when we're discussing calcium. So while this is true, in a calcium critical cropping system where we're stimulating plant growth with other fertility inputs, it's really easy for us to kind of outstrip the plant's ability to keep up supplying calcium to rapidly growing tissues. And in the growing system that I'm familiar with, we also deal with cool soil temperatures well into the bloom time in tree fruits, and sometimes for a period thereafter. So we're actually into past the fertilization of flowers. We have fruitlets on the trees. We still don't have a lot of root growth going on because soil temperatures are still cool. And so this critical timing for us for calcium nutrition, we often can benefit from supplementing with calcium fertilizers to help bridge that gap. And so to continue on with this process of calcium uptake from the soil, it helps to kind of look at what happens within the root hair. And this is a depiction of that here. So the outer surface of that root hair, calcium enters the plant through the epidermis, and it passes through this pathway outside of the cell membrane through the cell wall. So the apoplastic pathway. Once we get to the endodermis, the calcium ion would encounter this Casparian strip, which actually selectively forces calcium ions through the cytosol here in the endodermis. And then once through this pathway, the calcium ions would continue on through the pericycle and into the vascular tissue. And once calcium ions are in the vascular tissue, they're translocated to various transpiration sinks. And so wherever transpiration is taking place, calcium follows that pathway. And so when we see rapidly growing leaves, newly formed fruitlets, et cetera, that are transpiring, that's where we find calcium ions headed. The point of reviewing all of these things, the soil portion, ion exchange, and then also this pathway through and into the plant through the root hair, is to illustrate what's required for a calcium fertility program to succeed. And so we have a range of different calcium fertilizers to choose from. All of them are compounds, so molecules that must interact with this uptake mechanism in order to provide the plant with calcium it needs. In most cases, separating the calcium ion from its partner is required for the plant to take it in. And so this can really kind of throw a wrench in the spokes, if you will, with a lot of the options that we have. So let's take a look at some of those. This is a calcium input matrix. It was put together by our chief agronomist, John Kelly at Redox. And this is just to kind of help illustrate. These are traditional, many of them calcium sources. And there's a considerable range in cost and also in the efficiency and considerations that depend on soil chemistry and other factors for what you might choose to use for a calcium source. So if we start at the top here, starting with calcium sulfate or CATS, we can read here that solubility is good. That it's most effective, though, when soils are low in salinity and high in free lime. So there are situations where this product is a good fit, and it can, in those circumstances, make calcium bioavailability fairly good. The next one on the list is calcium sulfate or gypsum. Calcium sulfate in my neck of the woods is used very commonly. It's probably the largest soil applied calcium supplement that people use here. Calcium in general is very low in solubility. Once applied, what will be a plant available, how it will have run its course within the first 6 to 8 inches of water that's applied to the soil on top of that application. The remainder, the large portion of that application is likely to remain as calcium sulfate and remain in the soil in that form until it's actually washed through the profile at some point. And while the addition of gypsums to soils will often show an increase in calcium content and or an improvement in ratios in your soil sample, generally we do not see a measurable increase or improvement in plant response, just simply due to the fact that it's not very bioavailable. So, so moving on now to calcium chloride. Calcium chloride, another commonly used form of soil applied calcium. We also use this extensively as a foliar product here in the Pacific Northwest. While there's a history of research that shows the benefits of calcium chloride, it is still a relatively inefficient source of calcium from a bioavailability standpoint. On the plus side, calcium chloride is fairly cheap. We do, however, require a fairly frequent application regimen just to get the type of outcome that we want in many cases. And as a result, we often see some phytotoxic effects just from the chloride content when we use calcium chloride in large quantities. So there's some downsides as well as some pluses to calcium chloride. Calcium nitrate, CAN 17, both relatively good sources of calcium from a bioavailability standpoint and really great choices where nitrogen is needed. In many cases, we don't need more nitrogen, so those may not be on the list. And just, I want to make a point here. I'm going to touch on both calcium chloride and calcium nitrate a little bit later in the discussion. And so, we're going to be talking about these two in comparison to some redox stuff. Moving on to calcium carbonate or lime. Lime is another traditional calcium source commonly used in agriculture, still used extensively here, although in many cases it'd be nice to see it used more often. Literally in the neighborhood that I live in, we have irrigation water that's very low in mineral content. It tends to strip calcium from the soil. We have low soil pHs as a result of that, and that's compounded by the use of some acidifying fertilizers. And so we have the kind of the side effects of all that: compacted soils, poor root health. We have some difficulties with storage disorders. And in those scenarios, calcium carbonate or lime is really the ideal calcium source. And so there's a lot of very positive things about lime um, in those scenarios as a calcium source. Okay, last but not least, I want to talk about a couple of Redox products. So again, consistent with all Redox offerings, these are designed to resolve plant availability problems by protecting the charge on the calcium ion. In the case of Mainstay Calcium, Mainstay SI, both are listed as excellent in terms of bioavailability. Also worth noting is that the availability is not really conditional or dependent on a specific soil chemistry to perform well as a calcium source. So a lot of the things that we deal with, the kind of contingencies with traditional sources of calcium, we've been able to kind of sidestep those with the Redox technology. So this is kind of what these look like. Mainstay Calcium has traditionally been more of a soil applied product. Mainstay SI we use commonly as a foliar supplement. Both of them have soil and foliar labels. Mainstay Calcium is 20% calcium, calcium only. Mainstay SI, 10% calcium, also 22% silicon in the form of silicic acid. And for today's discussion, I'm going to just focus on Mainstay Calcium. So a little closer look at the label here. And in this case, both of these products, Mainstay SI, Mainstay Calcium, come in a conventional version and an organic version. What's unique about them is that the calcium, they're reacted products, so the calcium ions have been reacted with a proprietary carbon-based surfactant, which encapsulates that calcium ion and protects the charge. And so as a soil amendment or as a foliar amendment, the calcium in these products is much more bioavailable, if you will, when applied. So what we expect here is that once this product is actually in the soil solution, as depicted in this slide, that we're transferring calcium ions into the plant much more quickly, much more readily, without the resistance that we would normally have, the need for mineralization, ion exchange with the plant root, or we also believe that we have the ability to penetrate the root hair and the root itself in a much more broad area than just that limited area behind the root cap. And to support this, I just want to talk about a couple of examples. And really what we're focused on here, we have some basic research that's been done on calcium, but then we also have what we rely on for information exchange with growers and with field reps, a library of results within cropping systems. And so this is a redox result, we call it, that came from Mexico, and a study done by a PhD down there, Dr. Juan Cabrales. And what he did was he applied 3 different calcium sources using radioactive labels at transplant in the greenhouse to cucumber plants. And so what they did was they saturated the roots. So this was soil application with these 3 different calcium sources. In this case, it was calcium nitrate, calcium chloride, and then Redox Mainstay Calcium. And over the course of a 21-day period, they measured calcium levels with this radioactive measure. You can see it here. So it's a dry matter measure. And basically the bottom line was that the Redox Mainstay Calcium was assimilated 2.2 to 3.5 times more efficiently than either calcium nitrate and calcium chloride. And if you'll remember from the matrix, calcium nitrate and calcium chloride were a couple of the more efficient calcium sources that we have to choose from. And still, this Mainstay calcium product is much more readily absorbed than these two products. And so when we take this now into an actual cropping system, this is the type of thing that we can expect. This is a great example here, another Redox result that kind of examined a traditional gypsum-based calcium program to a very low rate Redox Mainstay calcium program on strawberries. So this was done by Holden Research down in California. The Redox program had 58% less in-season applied fertility units and 88% less applied units of calcium. So not only did they reduce the amount of calcium units they applied, but they also were able to reduce other fertility inputs just because of the calcium nutrition supporting what they were doing. Pardon me here, I just hit the wrong button there. Okay. So what we're doing is just comparing Redox calcium products to current grower standard calcium products. And then we're looking at marketable yield, comparative yield, applied units of calcium. And so here we are, in-season applied units of calcium, 88% less on the Redox. And then just in terms of marketable yield, essentially the outcome was the same. The comparative yield was also very close with a marginal increase on the Redox side, just in terms of the total yield per acre. And really that's the bottom line. So what the grower ended up experiencing here was an increase in net return about $2,200 an acre. And it was just simply because he was able to maintain the same yield levels with a considerably less input. Okay, so that's one way to look at what a efficient calcium program can do for you. The next example is really based on improving marketable yield dramatically, and this is something that we do here in the Pacific Northwest. The Honeycrisp apple has been, it's kind of the new kid on the block in many ways, but this particular cultivar, from a genetic standpoint, does not translocate calcium to the fruit as effectively as other cultivars do. And so we go after this with a range of different strategies, but efficient calcium nutrition is really an essential part of that. In many cases, growers can lose, even up to, I don't know, 75, 80% of their crop to either loss in the field, as what you see in the picture here on the ground, or after the crop is picked in storage, a lot of this bitter pit will come out. Part of the feature of this is that we're hard pressed to get enough calcium into the fruit during this absorption phase. And so if you look here on this chart, we have this absorption phase from the beginning of bloom for about 6 weeks while the fruitlets are still transpiring rapidly to get calcium in there during the cell division phase. And if we miss that, we just can never really recover from it. And what good calcium nutrition, plant available calcium nutrition can do for you in this time period is really to kind of optimize, maximize the amount of calcium that gets installed in between cell walls and binding those cells together. So we did a field trial which involved 3 different orchards a few years ago here. And this was really just to try to understand all of the things, why people, so Mainstay calcium is the most popular product, calcium product, with the distributor that we work with here in the Pacific Northwest. And so we wanted to kind of document that. So we took a look at Mainstay calcium treatments, a typical program that would be used by a field rep compared to a grower standard calcium program in 3 different orchards. And this is what we found when we measured cortex calcium content between the two in these three different archers. So on average, we had a 21% increase in calcium content in the cortex of the apples, which correlated nicely to this reduction in bitter pit incidence. So we actually saw about a 58% reduction in the incidence of bitter pit after 30 days in storage. Okay, so we picked fruit, stored it, picked clean fruit with no disorders on it, stored it, brought it back out 30 days later, and looked at it, and that's where we made these evaluations. So a really pretty dramatic difference, strongly correlated to calcium content in the cortex. And then if we look at that, just what it looks like out in the field, this is actually actual photos from one of those orchards. And on the left-hand side, the grower standard program plus the mainstay calcium applications in the soil. And then just grower standard on the right. And you can see pretty clearly, just visually, that there's quite a bit more loss in the field due to these calcium-related disorders. And so, you know, in commercial cropping systems, this is where we really get the validation of the effectiveness of this calcium, this encapsulation technology, and how well it works. Low rate applications of calcium, and you can still have these really nice outcomes in terms of calcium nutrition. And so whatever cropping system you're in, there's probably an opportunity for improving calcium nutrition. This might be you know, a choice that you might add to your quiver on calcium nutrition. And so here's the labels for the 4 different calcium products that have this encapsulation technology, the 2 conventional on the left, and then the 2 organic on the right. And at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions if we have any.